Welcome to FPA Live. I'm Noel Latif, President of the Foreign Policy Association. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you how you can engage with us on this program. To submit questions on Twitter, you can use @FPA_.org. You can also join in our discussion on FPA's Facebook page or in the live chat on our FPA 1918 YouTube channel. We're very pleased at FPA to co-sponsor this program with UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, ably represented in New York by my good friend, Ambassador Marcos Suazo. I am delighted to welcome to this forum Dr. Volker Türk, United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination. Volker is based in New York City at the United Nations Secretariat. Volker, you've had a fascinating global career with the United Nations that now spans over some 30 years. You grew up in Vienna, where you earned a doctorate at the University of Vienna and began your career with the UN as a 24-year-old law student. You have been posted around the world in a succession of senior roles for the UN Refugee Agency. Before coming to New York, you were the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection for the UN Refugee Agency. I don't think you could have anticipated that you would find yourself in the middle of a crisis that Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said, quote, is the greatest test that humanity has faced since the formation of the United Nations, end of quote. You are the linchpin in coordinating United Nations actions on COVID-19. Can you describe for us the global action plan you are charged with implementing and the main challenges you are facing?
Well, thank you very much, Noel, to have a chance to engage with the Foreign Policy Association, but also with the audience. Yes, it's been a massive challenge, as the Secretary General has said, and it's clear that this is probably one of the biggest challenges that the UN has faced in its 75 years. As you know, we also commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations this year. So it's the biggest challenge to multilateralism, but it's also in this commemoration, we also have the response, because it's absolutely clear that we need much more multilateralism at this point in time. The world is interconnected. The virus shows this. It doesn't know borders. It is also invisible. It's clear that we need to marshal all resources in order to get and overcome this. And so the idea is very much in terms of the challenges, as you can imagine, the biggest challenges that we face as humanity is to fight the virus. And the Secretary General has been absolutely clear how important it is to, first of all, do everything we can to find a solution in terms of testing, tracing, tracking, also diagnostics. The Secretary General was just involved in a massive initiative to find a vaccine, to develop a vaccine, to consider a vaccine as a universal, a global public good, because it's going to be absolutely crucial to ensure that everywhere around the world, all people have access to that vaccine once it is developed. So that's really one of the priorities. And there's a coalition of countries and private individuals, plus, of course, the pharmaceutical industry that have to come together to do it. And that coalition has just been built. But let me perhaps just say a couple of other things that are really the challenges of also the United Nations at this point in time. Clearly, on the political and peace and security front, we hope very much, and the Secretary General has been absolutely clear. He called for a global ceasefire in all conflict zones around the world. And frankly, the support that we heard, both from countries, but also from warring parties, was enormous. I mean, there seems to be a huge thirst for peace. And we had over 114 countries sign up to this agreement. We had, for this call, we had about 16 armed groups that said that they want to lay down arms. We had a whole avance, a whole social movement that signed on with millions of people calling for peace. So it shows what thirst there is out there. But at the same time, we also see the disconnect. Unfortunately, the situation, for example, in Libya has deteriorated. We have had some hope that Yemen may go in a positive direction. We are still hoping for it, but we're not there yet. So that's the first. The second is the humanitarian side. Most people in the most vulnerable situations around the world will be the most hard hit. And you can imagine, we haven't actually seen that side yet. There was a launch of a global humanitarian appeal of 2 billion that will be updated tomorrow. In fact, the number will certainly go up. At the moment, the United Nations, with its operations around the world, is assisting 110 million people in 57 countries around the world in order to provide relief, in order to ensure that we do the utmost to come to their aid. And that has to continue despite COVID. And you can imagine the challenges that people face in this type of situations. It's also clear that on the socio-economic side, that people are affected enormously. You probably saw the statistics from the International Labour Organization. They are talking about 300 million people affected in their employment. You can see that we may even have 500 million people moving back into poverty. So some of the gains that we have seen over the years, we will probably lose them. So it's absolutely crucial that we in the UN, and that's why the Secretary General has called for a socio-economic recovery fund, a multi-partner trust fund, to help countries in the immediate emergency phase to deliver whatever can be done on the socio-economic side. So essentially the challenge is, I think the biggest challenge is really solidarity, 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 especially in the global south, with those countries that are most affected, with the vulnerable populations that we currently do not see, and to make sure that we marshal the resources and the political will to support them. Because as the Secretary General has said, we are in the same one world, and we whatever happens in the most remote parts of the world will also be affecting us in New York or anywhere else. And the virus has brought this very much to life.
The Secretary General has issued a series of policy briefs that explore the impact of COVID-19 on human rights, women, children, and people with disabilities. Can you tell us a little about these briefs?
So it's very important for the Secretary General to show that there is a human face to this crisis, because among all the statistics and the health issues, we sometimes lose the momentum and don't see the individuals that are behind some of the things that we see. And it's clear, we see it here in New York. Older people in nursing homes, in institutionalized settings are the most hard hit. But it's not just their health, it's also social isolation, which is why we deliberately are choosing not social distancing as the term, but physical distancing, because it doesn't mean that you need to socially distance. You can connect with people, and there are many ways in this brief, for example, there are many good examples that are given how you connect with all the people, not physically, but by various other means, including through strong community mobilization. A very strong human rights brief that was issued, because human rights actually guide us in troubled times. They foresee and they put forward this indivisibility of the human rights framework. It's about economic, social, cultural rights, civil and political, and you can't separate them. You need to see them as a whole, and that's what the human rights brief does, very much adapted to the current situation of the pandemic. We see the same on women, a disproportionate effect on women. I mean, most health workers are women. So you can imagine how they are affected in a much, much stronger way than men. We also see an increase in domestic violence. So the Secretary General was very clear about peace in the world, but also peace at home. And he made a very strong call for this, which was really, which was replicated in many social media settings. We saw a groundswell of support for that. And we saw also countries writing to the Secretary General, about 150, saying that they are adopting national measures in order to counter some of the gender and domestic violence that we see as a result of lockdowns and shelter in place measures. So all these policy briefs highlight particular issues of concern, but they also offer solutions. They show what the UN can do in order to help, and they have an impact because we see this support from member states, from civil society, from the media, in order to make sure that the plight of older people, that the particular situation of women and girls, the particular situation of children, that the whole human rights framework is properly understood.
From your global vantage point, where do you think we are in the timeline of this pandemic?
Well, it's very difficult to answer this question because we are still at a time of uncertainty. It's clear that at the moment, the global north is hardest hit. We see this certainly in Europe, in a number of countries. We see it in North America, in particular in the US and in New York, in our hometown. It will at some stage, and we see the beginnings of it, also hit Africa, other parts of Latin America, and we have seen it already in Ecuador and Brazil, for example, with the numbers going up. We have seen in Eastern Europe the numbers going up. We see it also in parts of Asia, albeit that a lot of very early measures in Asia have really helped very much mitigate the impact of the virus in these countries. So it's difficult to predict what will happen over the next couple of weeks and months. There is a fear that there could be a ping pong of the virus from the global north to the global south and back. It's absolutely crucial to find the right diagnostics, therapeutics, medication, and then access to vaccine, which is the top priority. Because that's the only way to ensure that we have universal access to that as soon as possible. But this takes time. As you know, we don't know how long it will take, but we are to live with the consequences for some time. I mean, that's very clear. And we need in particular to take into account the massive impact that the virus has in the developing world. And not just on the health front, but also on the socioeconomic front, because you can imagine the livelihoods, the millions of livelihoods that are going to be affected in the developing world. And I think it's not often understood enough what that means and how this will affect people around the world.
Is the World Health Organization the UN's early warning system for pandemics? And how would you appraise its performance?
So the World Health Organization has an absolutely critical role to play in the current circumstances. The World Health Organization was founded by states. There are international health regulations that are adopted a decade ago that look at particular this situation of epidemics and pandemics. They play an extremely important role in order to detect early warning signals, to make sure that there's coordinated action, to ensure that we find the right response. They have been at the forefront of developing this alliance for the vaccine and for medication. They have an incredible network of research institutions around the world. So they play an absolutely critical role. They also depend on the cooperation of member states. And I think that's an extremely important aspect because we are as strong as member states cooperate with the institutions that they create.
The financial situation of the UN remains dire do you currently have the necessary resources to execute on a global action plan against this devastating pandemic?
So it's clear that we need more resources on the humanitarian front. So the 2 billion appeal that was launched about a month ago is only half funded. Tomorrow, and it's 2 billion. I mean, so it's 1 billion that we have received in terms of pledges. Tomorrow, because of how the situation has evolved in a number of countries, we know that the number will go up to about 6.5 billion that we need to cover humanitarian needs. So in that case, we only have about 13% funded. It's clear that we need a lot more funding for humanitarian activities around the world, and that's life-saving. It's about providing humanitarian relief. It's about making sure that testing, that equipment gets to those countries that are not in a position currently to deal with this. The Secretary General has also made available the supply chain network that exists within the United Nations. And quite impressively, we have managed to deliver, for instance, 1,200 metric tons of test kits delivered to about 52 countries in Africa, some of these extremely vital equipment. But we need clearly more funds for this. Then the second area is the SocioEconomic Recovery Fund, this multi-partner trust fund that was launched actually last week with very clear ideas of how countries in the Global South in particular need to be supported. And it's those with least resources, but it's also a lot of middle-income countries or lower middle-income countries that need support, especially on social protection issues, on community mobilization issues, on building up the health side and the health response. And that socioeconomic recovery at the moment is, again, a funding appeal for about 2 billion. We have not received much funding for this. It's about 60 million that we have received so far. And then, of course, there is the whole aspect of the WHO response. And they will, in fact, issue an updated response plan next week purely on the technical health related issues.
We have a follow-up question. How will you convince countries to support a socioeconomic response in addition to a health response?
You see, if the results of the crisis, just imagine in the developing world, people will have lost their jobs because some of the parts of the economy have come to a standstill. If people then move from an okay situation again into poverty, I mean, we're talking about 500 million people potentially that move back into poverty. We're talking about 300 million people where livelihoods get lost. It's clear that we need to do everything to provide a very basic social protection net function for people who are particularly affected in this crisis. So that side has huge implications. But just think also of children. I mean, at the moment, over 1 billion children are out of school in countries in the global north. They are connected. They can do distance learning. In many situations around the world, that's not possible because the infrastructure isn't there. The digital divide that we see between the developed and the developing world is huge. So a lot of children are not actually able to access schooling at the moment. And that's serious because it has all kinds of implications. There again, it's important to invest, to find ways and means to help countries overcome this current difficulty and to work with them on this. Again, there the United Nations can play an extremely important role and is playing an extremely important role with the global reach that we have. I mean, we are present in all countries around the world. We have this amazing ability to engage with populations, with societies, with governments, and help them go through this extremely difficult phase.
In this same vein, we have a question have you thought about establishing a global socioeconomic initiative similar to the Giving Pledge started by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, or perhaps asking them to partner with you?
So we have, of course, the Gates Foundation involved very much on the finding for the vaccine, and for the development and for the universal access to the vaccine, because that's the top priority. It's also clear that the needs of the developing world go well beyond what the UN is able to deliver. And there it's clear that we need, and this is already happening as we speak, the International Monetary Fund and the international financial institutions, in particular the World Bank and the World Bank Group, to step in. And they have stepped up. As you know, the International Monetary Fund has already approved 12.3 billion in emergency financing. The World Bank can provide about 160 billion of financing over the next 15 months. So these are going to be very, very important elements of the response. And they work directly with governments on making sure that some of these very serious socioeconomic consequences are being addressed. What the UN is going to do is very much at the community level, in cooperation with governments, to work out how you can actually instill some social protection networks that can have better effect on people as a result of that. But it's clear that the international financial institutions are our lifeline in this, and yes, it's going to be extremely important.
A broader question, if we can open the aperture a bit, do you think this crisis will lead to a renaissance of multilateralism and international cooperation?
I think people all over the world realize that the interconnection is much stronger, despite the fact that we're all in lockdown and borders are closed. But I do think that there is a realization that that the only way to deal with issues that are transboundary is through international cooperation, through multilateralism. So there is this hope that this is a big moment of waking up to the reality of what the UN has been standing for since its beginning 75 years ago, and that we come together as countries, as societies, as different actors, the private sector, the civil society, that we are all in this together, and that we are able to deal with it as global societies. And this hopefully will lead also to interesting initiatives on the part of member states and on the part of civil society at large, to ensure that we have functioning and powerful multilateral mechanisms and systems that respond to that. As we saw on the vaccine initiative, for example, the only way to do it is to do it together.
Are there any early lessons that we can learn from how this crisis has been handled thus far?
I think it's interesting to see that those countries that had invested in sustainable development, that have social protection schemes that are deep enough, that have an outlook that is very people-centered and people-oriented, are doing much better. The resilience in these countries is much higher. It's interesting that companies, we have this partnership with companies, with the private sector. Those who have oriented their whole outlook not just on making profit, but also helping to advance the sustainable development goals, they are doing better. So one early lesson is that actually what we have been standing for as the UN in terms of sustainable development goals, in terms of climate action, are the recipes to come out of this crisis and make us stronger in facing any future challenges. And I think that's an extremely important lesson to learn.
Do you see a robust economic recovery from COVID-19 impacted by actions taken by countries to isolate themselves from the rest of the world?
I mean, it's clear that inwardness, isolationism, a focus on oneself is a normal reaction when you're faced with a crisis, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. But those who emerge, and we have some very early indications, those who emerge from, I mean, especially in Europe, those who emerge from the first massive crisis situation have really started to look outside and say, well, yes, we had to focus on ourselves, but now it is time to see it as an opportunity to engage with the world in a very different way. So I think after the initial shock that, at least, you know, I'm an optimist, I think we're all optimists in the UN when it comes to these things, that actually it will lead to this realization that the only way to do it is by coming together and getting out of a national boundary type environment and seeing the advantages of how important it is to support countries and act in solidarity, especially with those who have less resources, who are going to be particularly affected, including emerging economies, and do our utmost to support them.
Unfortunately, we have time left for only one more question. The Secretary General has said that we have to build more resilience once this crisis is over. Will you be taking the lead in planning for pandemic prevention?
I mean, it's not me personally, but the UN system, of course. We have had quite a lot of discussions about one area that was meant to be the super year of nature. Unfortunately, because of the crisis, some of the events will have to be postponed. You know, it's about biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity. We also know that if you mix environments where animal to human transmission can occur, we need to keep wildlife wild and not mix it in ways that can then lead to transmissions. So an important aspect is, again, I come back to that earlier lesson learned. It's clear that this investment in the Sustainable Development Goals, as they were crafted in 2015 with the Paris Agreement on climate change, are going to be the future if we take that seriously. It's about biodiversity, it's about climate action, and also making sure that in the investments that are going to be made in the revitalization of the economy, that we use it as a chance to green the economy, to decarbonize, to get to the goals that we have set ourselves as international community for the better health of the planet, and ultimately, of course, for us as human beings. So this is going to be quite important. And the prevention side, frankly, the Sustainable Development Goals, climate action, I mean, what better prevention can you have in terms of massive future challenges that we need to avoid? I mean, the planetary side, you know, the hurricanes that we see, the extreme weather events are, in a way, an early warning signal as well, that it's not just about pandemics, but there are other things as well. And if we don't act together, and if we don't use this as an opportunity to step back, reflect, and act in a much more inclusive, equal, and with much more solidarity and equitable manner, then that's really the clarion call that we need to hear and act on.
Volker, I'd like to thank you and your colleagues for all the hard work you're putting into coordinating the global response to COVID-19. We look forward to an in-person event with you in the not too distant future. Let me thank our audience for their participation. Until our next edition of FPA Live, this is Noel Latif signing off with our motto at FPA: an informed public is an engaged public. Stay safe and take care.
Thank you very much, and wishing you all the best.